The story behind the first international access to justice study, what many call the Florence Project, begins in early 1973 with a chance meeting between Professor Mauro Cappelletti and myself. Before then, we didn't know each other or of each other's research in the legal aid world, but we were both appointed to an advisory committee the Ford Foundation had just created. Its purpose was to advise a newly established program to expand legal aid in the developing countries. Anyway, during the introductions, Mauro learned I had been director of the War on Poverty's National Legal Services Program in the 1960s, which was the first time in history the US government had funded civil legal aid, and that I had written a history of the development of that program, which would be published the following year under the title Justice and Reform. More significantly, I learned Mauro and Jim Gordley, a comparative law professor at the University of California, had just published companion law review articles tracing the history of legal aid in the Western world from Greek and Roman times through the Middle Ages to current programs in a few selected countries in Western Europe. Having heard that, I was delighted when Mauro invited me to dine with him that evening. I didn't know, however, that he had an agenda for that meeting. By the end of that dinner meeting, I had learned enough about Mauro and what he was doing to be pleasantly surprised when he invited me to spend a few weeks the coming summer in Florence working on a book he wanted to publish. That book was to be the first in the world comparing legal aid systems in several countries. The book would republish his and Gordley's law review articles, but then add the actual statutes and regulations and court decisions governing legal aid in all those selected legal aid programs, along with an article by a local scholar from each country summarizing the history and development of that nation's system. So it was a rather ambitious task. I said I would be willing to come to Florence the next summer to work on this project, but only under one condition: that I be able to write an analytical essay to join Mauro's and Gordley's articles in the book. He agreed, and by June 1973, I was off to Florence. When I arrived, I found that Mauro's Comparative Law Center was housed in a rather old, inauspicious office building, maybe a block or so from the law school. But it was a sizable operation. 4 or 5 assistanti, who were young scholars hoping to become professors, but in the meantime indentured to full professors as research assistants. Then there were typically a half dozen or so visiting professors from other countries, most of them working on their own research projects, but sometimes on Mauro's. Then there always was a recent American law graduate under a special arrangement Mauro had, I believe, with Stanford Law School in California. Altogether, it was a most intellectually stimulating environment. I returned to Florence again in 1974, and by the end of that summer, we were nearing completion of the book, which was published in 1975 under the title Toward Equal Justice, a comparative study of legal aid in modern societies, all 756 pages of it. But it was during that summer that the concept of a still more ambitious study emerged, one that was broader in scope in 2 ways. First, it would be broader than legal aid in seeking out and discussing other promising approaches for enhancing access to justice for poor people. And second, it would reach out to many more nations in that search. In any event, during that summer, we sent a proposal to the Ford Foundation, which seemed a logical source for funding of our proposed research project. And in fact, Ford was so interested that they sent the staff member in charge of legal-related programs to meet with us that very summer of 1974. And before I returned to the U.S., we learned Ford would be funding the project. As it turned out, I was scheduled to have a sabbatical starting January 1975, and between that and a salary from the Ford grant, I could afford to spend that entire year on the project. So in January, my wife Barbara and I moved to Florence. Mauro and I were listed as co-directors of the project, but he was really the overall head. My main task the first few weeks, which was to draft the questionnaire we would be sending out to scholars in the nations we planned to supply reports for the published study. It was essentially an outline of topics and subtopics we wanted them to address in describing developments in their respective nations. Meantime, Mauro was lining up the scholars who would do the research and produce the national reports that would make up a good deal of the final study, as well as the raw material for some comparative analysis. There was no doubt Mauro was the international leader of the study of comparative procedural law. As a result, he had personal contacts with scholars around the world who either were interested in access to justice issues or who knew others who were. We also made full use of scholars from other countries who were visiting Mauro's Comparative Law Center. During the summers I visited the center, and the nearly a year I spent there in 1975, there was a steady stream of those visitors, many of whom I got to know well. They were from England, France, West Germany, East Germany, Poland, Japan, Sweden, the Netherlands, and even one from Russia, while it was still the Soviet Union. Altogether, the source of multiple perspectives and multiple insights. My other assignments included assembling a team to work with me in producing the report for the US and finding authors for the Canadian report. I also undertook to begin preparing a theoretical overview of possible approaches to increasing access to justice, which was about half completed when I returned from the center to the US, and is found in volume 3 of the final published report. But completion of that lengthy theoretical essay, along with the writing and editing of the United States report for volume 1, and researching and writing the final synthesis essay for volume 2, would be spread over the next 3 years. Most of that writing was done in California, although I did return to Florence the summer of 1977. By that time, Mauro had moved the project and the rest of his comparative law enterprise to the newly established European University Institute housed in a 14th century monastery on a hillside outside Florence. By that time, I also was busy directing the program on dispute resolution policy at the University of Southern California. That occupied most of my time and it made it impossible for me to participate in any fashion in the daunting task of editing the 6 books that comprise the 4 volumes and thousands of pages of the Florence Access to Justice set. That time-consuming endeavor was left in the hands of Professor Cappelletti and his co-editors Bryant Garth and Joel Weisner. Bryant Garth, by the way, later became the director of the American Bar Foundation, which is the preeminent research institution on the American legal profession and legal institutions. He also authored several award-winning books, most of them international studies. It is now Over 4 decades since the Florence Project told us where we were then, that is, as of the mid-1970s. Now we need to know where we are and where we should be going in the 2020s. I couldn't end this story of the Florence Access to Justice Project without paying homage to Mauro Cappelletti. I've never met a more brilliant, creative, or hard-driving person. He was demanding of himself and also of all those worked with or under him. Then in his mid-50s, Mauro had a commanding presence and was an impressive speaker. All the attributes of a natural leader, which he was. He also was fluent in over a half-dozen languages, of some value when you are a comparative law professor. In many respects, Mauro was very non-Italian compared to other Florentines we met during our stay there. Florentines tended to be easygoing and indirect in their comments and criticisms, but Mauro had been born and raised in the far north of Italy, an area more Austrian than Italian, and it showed. But he was self-aware enough to recognize this. He ends his foreword to the Access to Justice volumes with some words for Bryant Garth, Joel Weisner, and myself. And I quote, "For a friendship which remarkably resisted the brusqueness of my mountaineer's character." In any event, I shall be forever grateful that I said yes to Mauro's invitation. We have dinner together that evening in New York City nearly 50 years ago. It was the beginning of a great adventure that expanded my vision and changed my life forever.